Hi, I'm Olivia Sharp, a partner within the executive search practice at Edenbridge Partners, specialising in HR appointments. I'm also personally involved in our approach to inclusion at Edenbridge, both in our approach as an employer and how we drive discussion and action on the topic externally. So we've invited people from our network to share their stories and experiences at work, their personal journeys, and what we can all do to help create a more inclusive workplace. In this episode, we shine a spotlight on social mobility. Helping to improve social mobility is hugely important. We believe that every person, irrespective of their background, should be able to achieve their full potential. For those who are new to the subject, social mobility refers to change in a person's socio-economic situation, either in relation to their parents and wider family, intergenerational mobility, or throughout their lifetime, intra-generational mobility. Social mobility is linked to equality of opportunity, the extent to which people have the same chances to do well in life, regardless of the socio-economic background of their parents, their gender, age, sexual orientation, race, ethnicity, birthplace, or other circumstances beyond their control. Research has shown that people from disadvantaged backgrounds have fewer opportunities to climb the socio-economic ladder. In European OECD countries, children with the greatest socio-economic disadvantage grow up to earn as much as 20% less than adults with more favourable childhoods. Across OECD countries, it takes nearly 5 generations for children from low-income families to approach the average income in their country. In addition, approximately 65% of working-age OECD citizens worry that they won't be as financially secure as their parents. An almost equal share fear their children will be even less secure. We also know that people who are most concerned about their chances in life are also less happy and feel less well represented in politics. Which brings us to the podcast today. And I'm delighted to be here today with Daniel Casimir and Rob Bray discussing how the corporate world can promote and secure equality of opportunity.
So my name's Daniel Casimir. I am the Chief People and Procurement Officer of the company called TalkTalk. We put internet into people's houses and businesses, and I've been a Chief People Officer for more years now than I care to remember. In addition to TalkTalk, I'm also the chairman of an employment board at a prison, which is interesting. I'm a trustee at the Lowry Theatre in Manchester, which is, I think, the largest cultural centre outside of London, which is good fun. I've got 5 kids, which is a lot of fun, and I've got a couple of grandchildren that live in Miami, which is a great place to go and visit. And I think I probably can describe myself as being an honorary Mancunian. I went there with my first job after university, and I've hung around ever since. So yeah, that's me in a nutshell. When I'm not working, I quite enjoy exercise and cinema and current affairs and stuff like that. And that's me.
So I'm Rob Bray, and until recently was the CPO of Nando's in the UK and Ireland. Nando's 500 restaurants and 22,000 people across those countries. I've been working in HR. I used to be a headhunter a long way back. So I started off in search, and I've been in HR people for a long time now, 16, 17, 20 years, I think now. So in addition to the HR or people world, I'm very, very passionate about sustainability and do a lot of work in that space. One of my particular interests at the moment is regenerative agriculture and vertical farming and how that comes together. So big focus on that. I have no grandchildren, definitely no grandchildren, and 2 younger boys. And wherever we can, we like to go and explore the world and eat interesting things and travel together as a family. My kids are still young enough to want to be with me, so that's. I was told wonderfully you only get 18 summers, and so I'm trying to make the most of those 18 summers.
Very wise.
Yeah.
Daniel, Rob, maybe you could tell us a little bit about your relationship to the subject of social mobility, what it means to you, and why you're happy to participate in the conversation.
I think for me, as a Chief People Officer of a business with a couple of thousand people, we prided ourselves on being a very inclusive culture, and that means that social mobility and just getting the widest, broadest group of people to come work for us is just really, really, really important. And we spent a lot of time and effort to try and be successful in that space.
Thank you.
I mean, a lot of similar themes actually, but I'll probably come at it from a personal perspective. My dad was the first person in his family that went beyond school at 16 and worked hard and went through education and actually was the product of social mobility. So he was able to work through his career into, sort of senior business positions. And so I've seen that firsthand. I've also been lucky enough throughout my career to work a lot with young people. Sort of businesses and brands I've been in have focused a lot on youth and youth employment. And so I've actually seen firsthand how the impact that can have on people's changing their prospects and, good jobs and what the impact of good jobs can do. So a bit of personal and a bit of professional is sort of why it matters to me.
And it crosses into the personal for you as well, Daniel, doesn't it? Outside of your role as a Chief People Officer.
No, very much so. So outside of work, I'm chairman of an employment board at a prison, which has been incredibly rewarding in terms of just getting prisoners to work while they're in prison and then upon release, and that's been great. But I think the thing that was quite profound for me in terms of really getting me towards social mobility was actually sort of during lockdown. So we're in Salford, Greater Manchester, and we're in an area of sort of a really quite significant social deprivation. So you sat and you looked outside and you thought, what on earth can we do? And I'm sure we'll get into it. I'll talk about, we actually managed to do quite a lot of stuff which had very direct impact in an area of sort of immense social poverty. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it's been quite rewarding.
Well, why don't we start there? Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey with Talk particularly, but some of those successes that you've experienced as an organisation?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the a fundamental challenge of social mobility now is digital poverty. And I think it's really quite difficult for you to be able to jump in and participate in the labour market in any way, shape or form, even just applying for a job if you can't be online. So I was sitting in the sort of the Ordsall estate, or looking at the Ordsall estate from my sort of office window during COVID, and I thought, right, what can we do? How do we do something? So actually we managed to get together with the Department of Work and Pensions and actually formed a sort of, a sort of a relationship, a partnership with each other. And we were able to to offer 6 months free internet to anybody who was a job seeker on long-term who was unemployed. And and the results of it were actually quite humbling. And the stories that started to come through, there was very early on there was a guy who'd spent 6 months trying to get a job as a working in a warehouse driving a forklift truck, couldn't do anything. And then as a result of being able to have access to the internet, within 2 weeks he's actually got a job, because that's how people have got to do it. And it was just a really small thing, but it's like, whoa. And I think the cool thing is that actually as corporations, I think there are some really good opportunities to jump in and make some quite big differences to people's lives. And, from that, I jumped in and we got further and we did more. But, for me, one of the really big things was digital poverty. And, I think that's just something we don't really talk about, but it's a really big thing. And the more that we can just help people get online and then participate in society, that's a really big deal.
It sounds fantastic, the work you did, and I've worked with a school as a governor, and certainly we've seen that as part of the challenges for children through the lockdown period as well, access to technology, internet, to be able to keep up with their learning. And it's what the education system is really struggling with at the moment, and will impact those children's opportunities when they get to the end of school.
And I think it's something that we we take internet access as something granted. We assume that we've all got it, but there's the exact numbers. There's like a couple of million households in the UK which just don't have it, and for all sorts of reasons, it's now nigh on impossible to apply for benefits if you're not online. It's pretty impossible to apply for a job actually if you're not online, and that really just cements and makes a big wave in society in terms of people not being able to jump through that social barrier. So I think getting people online, certainly my learning as we've been through COVID and beyond, is a really important thing. And actually the solutions are quite straightforward. You can make really big differences really quickly. And then you start to take that further forwards. We've got challenges in society in terms of long-term sick, so people who can't necessarily make it to work, but actually they can work online from home remotely, because we've now got hybrid working and it's there. So I think there's just all sorts of ways that we can just help people really quite inexpensively engage in work where we need work. We've got a shortage of people participating, and I think the more that we can do that, the better, and it's quite high impact.
And you've done a lot of work with kind of early careers, young people coming out of education and moving into organisations. Have you seen similar things that Daniel has seen?
It's interesting. I mean, there's lots of parallels. My personal perspective is less from a digital inclusion standpoint and more about actually, and I suppose the language of social mobility is probably newer to me. I would have thought about it more as economic inclusion historically, and how do you get people from excluded communities and sort of areas of lower sort of economic development and get them into work. But I've worked in retailers and hospitality over the years, and the reality is the barriers to entry for those jobs are really quite low, and they are hyper local. So, you know, they are the end of the street or they are in your community. And so a lot of the work that I've done over the years is how do you remove those barriers to mean that it is as an addressable a job as possible, and actually creating an environment whereby typically young people, because they're often early on in their working life, but typically young people come in and they have that good experience of work where they're nurtured, there's a focus on self-confidence, there's a focus on sort of soft skill and hard skill development. And what I love about particularly hospitality as a sector is if you can bring people into that environment and they last maybe a year, maybe 18 months, they do develop enormous numbers of social skills they wouldn't otherwise have, which then stand them, and we've seen it and we've tracked it, in great stead throughout their lives, because holding eye contact as a 16-year-old is one of the core skills that unfortunately in education today is not something that's really, that pastoral side of education is not as prevalent as perhaps it once was. And I think businesses are having to step into a little bit, I don't want to say avoid, but there clearly has been an age of austerity for a long period of time, and primary social services have been reduced over the course of the last decade plus. And so businesses have almost a social responsibility in my mind to step into the gaps that ultimately their skills can be best suited to help serve. And there are examples in so many different areas, be it, you know, almost football foundations on one end who step in and do amazing work on a very local basis. And I'm sure the same as in Manchester as it is in London, but, you know, people doing a really, really close work to help their communities. And I think brands, and particularly consumer brands, have an increasing responsibility around that, because customers will expect it, and we're in the age of transparency now. So if you're not stepping into it, it's a challenging spot.
And I want to come back to the role of business in the community in this context in a minute, but I'm going to just pick up on the point you made around data. It can be a notoriously difficult thing to track and to record, and people, it can be a sensitive subject as well to talk about in terms of getting people to declare whether that's any type of protected characteristic. How have you managed to track that in your organisations? What successes have you had, and what have you learned along the way?
I think some good, some bad, to be honest, and a lot of learning over the course of the years. Clearly, GDPR is a very challenging issue in this space, and also people self-declaring. You know, they don't really want to admit what their circumstances are in many instances. But over the years, we've worked with third parties. We do a lot of internal surveying through different platforms, but we particularly worked with one third party who is doing and continues to do a longitudinal study on the number of people and their socio-economic backgrounds at the point of hire, so potential talent pools and also those who are hired. So things like, were you on free school meals at 14 or 16, I forget which one it is, but one of those two, and also what was the primary income of in the household that you were growing up in. And we, by using that tracking methodology and sort of really getting into that, now it's a sample of, what was it? It was probably just under 2,000 people that we sampled, and it continually done sort of drumbeat every 6 months. We know who we're hiring, and therefore what we can classify as impact hires. And I think that's been a really, really big step forward. But the data, someone very wise said to me about 5 or 6 years ago, never get behind on the data. And at the time I was thinking, no, we're doing good stuff with NGOs and third parties, and that's fine, we'll get to that. No, the data, you have to be able to prove the return on effort. Otherwise it's all just nice, not quite vanity projects, but until you can prove you're doing something meaningful, you have to do that. Tricky though.
Yeah, incredibly difficult. What about from your perspective, Daniel?
Very, very, very similar experiences. Quite a lot of focus on upfront data analytics at the point of hiring. That seems to be the place where you can get sort of the best data, and then quite good tracking in terms of how people have gone on as they've gone through, and then very much the sort of socio-economic backgrounds, etc., etc. So no, we've done that and sort of done that reasonably well. We've also worked with sort of a number of third-party agencies who have helped us source and attract people and stuff, and they're quite good at terms of sort of bringing people forwards. I think that for us, the data's great to measure once you've gotten hold of people, but getting hold of people to come in and sort of and actually present themselves to say, actually, whoa, I'm going to come and work in this sort of this corporate environment has been the real big challenge. And one of the things that was actually sort of illuminating for us is that during COVID, we participated quite heavily in the government's Kickstart scheme. So this was offering 6-month placements to 18 to 24-year-olds, and so we got into it and said, right, we're going to really focus intensively of getting people to come and work for us from the local area. And we had sort of probably from the immediate local area, we probably had 100 young people come and work for us. And it was like, whoa, okay, right, we're going to go for it. But what was really sort of, quite, when you talk about demographics and backgrounds, you could see where people had come from and stuff. And this was, area of sort of economic deprivation. And, the emotion of people walking into this corporate office and saying, oh my God, I didn't think I'd actually be able to walk in the door and work in a place like this was absolutely incredible. So once we'd actually got hold of them, then we sort of tracked them and probably got 60-70% of them still working for us now, and they're progressing through. And the reaction from our business has been, wow, these people are absolutely brilliant, fantastic. They're hungry, they want to do stuff. But it was just that whole thing of like, well, where do we get the people from in the first place? So yeah, I think I wish I had more of a problem in measuring. My challenge is I can't get enough of them. And that's a big challenge.
And also one of the later challenges, once you've found people to join you, is about being inclusive as an organisation. So it's all very well inviting people to come into your business, but actually how do you help them feel like they truly belong is a massive challenge for organisations, and where it often goes a bit off the boil. Have you found that there have been particularly things that have worked for you to make sure that people do feel included from day one, and so therefore feel like it's a place they should stay?
So I think certainly, Nando's is a wonderfully culturally rich business, very focused on values and purpose, and it's very sort of people first. And so that provided a great platform or sort of fertile ground for this type of work. I think if we'd gone into a different type of organisation that didn't have that, then the ideas, particularly within the restaurants, where the general managers of the sites create incredibly strong family units of people who are typically first time into work. So a third of the people who join Nando's have never had a job before, and another 2/3 have never worked in hospitality before. So there's a lot of new people coming in and doing this as a first gig, if you like. And that's kind of the role hospitality plays in the economy. It's sort of that starting transitioning point. But you have to create that environment and have to have leaders who are focused on spotting the individual, and it does become a very individual point. And what we moved away from over the years is even identifying people as from a programs or from a, we did work with Kickstarter as well, and very successfully, good scheme, but we didn't label people in the same way because we didn't want them to be seen to be different. Actually, they were just another member of the team. And they came in and, were given the same environment, the same opportunities. What we did do, though, is bring in some different talent spotting programs, which was a bit unusual. We were targeting people within their first 6 months. Now, normally in our sort of sector, you wouldn't go that early into the talent pools. But actually what we wanted to do is sort of stimulate that thought of actually there could be a career here, because very few people come to restaurants and think, oh yeah, this is going to be my career for life. So by getting that and by changing the conversation and creating those opportunities through a platform, it just made people think a little bit differently. And it's one of those things I suspect will take the next 5+ years to really measure or see the impact, the measurable impact. But we had definitely early green shoots.
And if you utilise schemes like mentorship programs, reverse or otherwise, and sponsorship programs through your organisations to get the traction through the hierarchy, if you like.
So we did exactly that. We would start off with are quite selective of the managers that we use to actually sort of participate in the program. We train them very, very, very heavily, And it's actually created a little bit of a thing in the business of, well, actually, I want to be a manager that actually gets to participate, because actually we've, built the status up of the managers that sort of that drive this, that mentor people, etc. So it's actually created some good internal momentum. And I'd absolutely encourage everybody just to get stuck in and just, make the managers feel special. Because I think with you've got the right managers leading people, mentoring, bringing people in, that's how you can really drive success. Otherwise, if you get the wrong person, it'll just fall on, because these people tend to be vulnerable. They need a certain amount of hand holding. For many of them, it will be their first time at work. So people who have just get it and have the empathy to be able to deal with that's really important.
And have a passion to make it successful.
100%.
As well.
Totally.
Can I just pick up on a little bit of something there? We had to strike a really careful balance between being that inclusive, supportive environment, but also having people who were job ready, because what we couldn't do into the busy nature of the restaurants is bring people in who needed very, very heavy employment support. So what we tried to do is work with our third parties to get them as ready as possible, but we only hired job ready people. And that was, again, a mistake from the early days. We tried to bring people in who needed greater levels of support, and it was just too much of a burden on the management teams. So yeah, that was also a learning. It has to be a commercial win-win as well as doing the right thing. It's a balance of both.
No, very, very similar. We did quite a lot of work with some of the trusts to actually sort of just train people, get them ready, because it was their first time. So we'd also made a mistake of hurrying people in, and they just weren't quite ready. So we invested and sort of got them ready, and I think that's really important.
And doing that investment pre-hire to make sure that they can land well and they've got everybody's in the right place for it to be a successful
The Prince's Trust was particularly sort of helpful, and they did some quite good stuff for us. So there's plenty of agencies out there.
Yeah, exactly.
And how have you approached that hiring process to try and be as inclusive as possible, but also avoid the bias or the preconceptions that may come through in those hiring processes, to make sure that you can bring different people into your organisation and enable this social mobility to happen?
I might have a bit of a short answer on this one. So in the restaurant world, those biases, if that's even the right word, don't really exist. It is a very inclusion, diverse workforce is not the challenge. Nando's, for example, has 500 sites around the UK, typically overlapping with areas of, obviously high streets and different areas, but there is also an overlap with areas of social deprivation. That is where the labour pool comes from. It's where the talent comes from. So that it's not so much on the way in, it's bringing it through the organisation.
Once it becomes a more corporate environment, you mean?
Yeah, no, in order to ensure that we're bringing people through the right way.
So those promotion
It's
processes.
not so much the recruitment process. The recruitment process, it's as much how close do you live and what hours can you work, right? And then once you turn up, we're like, do you have the right attitude and smart? We can train everything else. There's no other requirements other than having a good attitude and being able to work the right patterns. So the challenge is more in pulling the talent through.
And developing them through their career.
Exactly, yeah.
And Daniel, you've worked a lot with the prison service, who are, going back to the point around being job ready, really actively working on how you set up ex-offenders to be job ready and ready for the workforce. Would you mind telling us a little bit about that? Because it's such a different world to the corporate environment.
Wow, we can talk about this for hours. I haven't got hours, so I'll try and be succinct. Ministry of Justice set up a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago, a scheme that put employment boards in place in the 92 open prisons that exist in the UK. So these are the 92 prisons that release people. And the focus is, right, if people leave prison with a job to go to, then the chances of reoffending falls away. So that's okay, that's a great theory. So we set boards up, and my prison's a prison in near Warrington called Thorn Cross. We've got 420 men there. And essentially we divide people into three categories. We have people who are training while they're while they're doing their sentence. We have industries that operate within the prison, so we have like a Timpson's workshop and some other stuff that goes on, and then we have about a third of the men go out to work every day with different employers, and the focus is to try and get those employers to convert those into proper jobs when people leave, and it's and it's brill. But the thing that you find is that the guys that end up in prison, there's a whole mix, but probably half the people that end up in prison grew up in the care sector. Around about 10% ex-military. So you've had people who have arrived there with the most pressing and unfortunate of circumstances. And the notion of being sort of work ready, job ready is just like, yeah, it's almost an anathema. And so an awful lot of work and investment goes in terms of just preparing and getting people to sort of to go on and just work. And it's quite interesting. We talk about sort of how do corporates jump in and sort of and help out. It's really, really interesting. One of the sort of the biggest contributions that corporates can make to sort of helping getting prisoners out working is mentoring. It's somebody who has experienced work of just sitting down with somebody and just telling them how it is. This is what it's going to be like. These are going to be the expectations of you. And, and helping sort of, direct them into a particular sort of course of work and employment, etc. And, it's no different to anything that we've talked about with young people. It's people who have just had they've had a bad deal, they've had a bad time, did something wrong. It's about second chances. And and really helping quite vulnerable people into that world of work is great. And when it works, it's absolutely brilliant. So I spend a lot of time working with James Timpson of Timpsons, and yeah, it's an amazing story. I think 15-20% of the people who work in Timpsons, are ex-offenders. And James will tell you the stories of the good stuff, the bad stuff, etc. But what you're creating, and I don't think it's just about prisons. I think it's more generally in terms of social inclusion. If you can put yourself out there to give people a chance, it's very, very, very rare that will blow up in your face. Of course it's going to blow up in your face sometimes, but generally people will be so grateful for the opportunity that you've stuck your neck out, you've given them an opportunity, that it'll be very successful. And I find that in terms of the employers I now work with, who are working with with ex-offenders, the experience is very positive. But I would actually span that into the young people that we work with, etc., etc. And I think it's just for organisations it's just a no-brainer to be involved here. There's a great workforce that's just waiting to to get stuck in and be given an opportunity, and that's what we're trying to do.
And it's probably a very good example of where organisations can create an even stronger psychological contract between employer and employee. And you talked about kind of the gratitude in the relationship, but the more that is reinforced right from day one, they feel included, they feel like this is a great opportunity, then surely it makes absolute commercial sense to the whole organisation, not just the people function, to make these kinds of schemes work, because that's what we're all trying to do, find great talent and keep it.
Totally, and I don't think it matters. We ran a conference recently with all sorts of people from all sorts of organisations representing across the spectrum in terms of social mobility. And there's loads of organisations, there's loads of people who have got different circumstances, but I think it's absolutely true across the whole remit that actually, if you can give somebody an opportunity who wouldn't have otherwise had it, they'll just it'll work well. We've done quite a lot of stuff in terms of a neurodiversity. And again, that requires an investment and adjustments to work, but we haven't yet had something that's bitten us on the head and said, "Ooh, this was absolutely terrible." So as long as you're prepared to put the investment in, the returns I think are actually really quite high.
And I think what's so interesting to me is that the conversations I have on a regular basis are the direction of travel for the HR function, which feels a lot like a tension at the moment between standardisation, process, creation of shared services, making sure that you've got driving efficiency through the function, with the tension of also needing to treat all employees as an individual and design an individual experience and create an individual employment contract. So they're not easy things to balance, are they, in your roles?
No. I'd probably also layer on top, which is what's the social contribution of the business? Going back to my earlier point, because yes, I am slightly biased, but having worked in consumer businesses, consumer brands, 16 plus years. But if businesses can't answer what they're contributing and where they're contributing, that's the customers will ultimately vote with their feet, and they will see that it will have a revenue impact, be that from an environmental or a societal perspective. And I think that does slightly change. Not only is there the hyper personalisation of the employee journey and the standardisation, but there's also that point around contribution, really, because that, I suppose, one of the conversations I've had a lot recently is are businesses seeing this as a threat of how they have to manage the threat, or are they seeing it as a commercial opportunity? And my personal view is there's market share opportunities if businesses can step forward and do it well and be prepared to make a few mistakes along the way, because certainly my experience is there have been things that have not gone, that have seemed very straightforward and not have a right answer. You know, we partnered with a few different NGOs, it all seemed very sensible and it would work. It was probably a blind alley that we went down, right? There were different ways of cracking the same challenge. But I feel that's putting different onus into the HR function as well, because actually that role of the CPO is like, what are the social issues? What does it mean? Where do we play? What USP do we have as a business? Therefore, what should we be talking about? Because the employees want it and the customers want it as well.
And you have to look at it through the lens of investors and stakeholders as well, shareholders, the rise of the ESG agenda. This all plays into that space. And I said we would come back to the role of the organisation in society, and you've started us off really nicely, Rob. But in your view, what is the role of a business, an organisation in tackling some of these issues, but in kind of the wider social purpose?
I think that the word I was going to use, you've taken it out of my mouth, is sort of his purpose. So I think in two respects. I think in respect of employees, increasingly employees want to work in organisations that have got a strong sense of purpose, particularly sort of around social purpose. So actually, you go back sort of a number of years, they'd have sort of had a look at some of these things that, it's the sort of, it's the HR function off on one. But actually now, it's really sort of, it's like, well, what are you doing? And when you're sitting, talking about interview, people will ask about how you're contributing to society, what are you doing in terms of the environment, etc., etc. And if you want to get really good engagement, really good caliber of people, it's not an option. Which then goes into the second part. It's absolutely sort of good for business. It's good for your ability to retain talent. It's good in terms of driving performance in your organisation. It's great. And so I think for me, the role of corporations and promoting the social agenda, I think is quite ubiquitous. I'm not sure that you can just put your head under the desk and ignore it. That your employees are looking really hard and judging you quite hard in terms of how you're jumping in, how you're participating. And I've been really quite humbled and actually quite impressed when we do this stuff. This has been this is a lot of employee-led stuff of people jumping in saying, actually, can we do a bit more of this? Can we do a bit more of that? And so I think it's good for business. And I think that, as a result of it, for corporations, it's just, I don't think it's even a discussion about can you be involved or not to be involved. I think if you leave it alongside, I think your employees will look up and say, I think you're wanting here. What's actually going on? What sort of business are we? What sort of employer are we? So I think you don't have a choice.
Yeah, we've certainly seen those conversations playing out in the work that we do here at Eatonbridge. Before people are willing to meet clients as candidates, they want to understand what's the purpose of the organisation. We started having these conversations early on in 2020. What has the organisation done? What's been their response to COVID? How have they treated people? And now has broadened out much wider to, what's the social conscious of this organisation? Tell me more about the organisational purpose and its impact on the community.
I find it's just really interesting as people do their due diligence to come along and join. They've got a list of questions of what are you doing here and how does that work, and it's quite incredible. So I think that you ignore it at your peril.
Yeah, I think if I remember the days of old, you would have a community who were going to paint a school. That just doesn't cut it anymore. I think the way I think about it is more, how do you weave the core processes of your business, and recruitment's an obvious one, but in a business that hires a lot of people every year, more than 10,000 people a year, how do you do that recruitment practice in a way that has social impact? So rather than thinking of something different, or, CSR Evolve was sat on the side of the business, it's sort of an auxiliary activity. It's how do you make these core things happen? How do you buy your products differently? How do you think about sustainability of the supply chain? How do you think about that from an integrity perspective? Because you're absolutely right, the best talent chooses that way. And you have to be able to be clear. I think what's important is you also don't have to have all the answers, because I think there is also a trend within organisations that to say that you've got it all sorted and you know how to combat climate change, and you know how to combat social fragmentation in the country, or you know how to deal with Brexit segregation, or whatever the thing that goes on. Clearly, companies can't resolve all of these big challenges from a sort of national level. but they do need to have a view and an opinion on areas that are close to their own business. And we've seen the impact. We've seen the impact on engagement. We've seen the impact on morale, and also ultimately, as we said earlier on, it helped us navigate through the pandemic in a very different way because it engendered a much deeper sense of loyalty and connection.
I think that there's beyond purpose. People generally want to work for organisations that are inclusive. That becomes a thing, and one of the very powerful things that I've sort of experienced the last couple of years is we set up employee networks, or rather our employees set up networks, so covering all sorts of issues. That could be sort of networks for parents. We have a Talk Pride network. We have all sorts of networks coming on, and there's just it's amazing the sort of the passion and vigour that people get stuck into this and promoting these issues of how can we sort of really work to make sure that we're inclusive. And then that comes into the social agenda because it's a demand for our employees saying, yeah, well, what are we doing? Can we do more here? Can you, what's going on? So again, just further evidence of it. It's not even a nice to have. There's just this latent expectation that you make it happen.
It's become absolutely critical for people that organisations can talk about this.
I do think it's an interesting point there at the moment because I'm not sure customer money is flowing behind these agendas yet. So a lot of the research would indicate that, yes, people put it in their top three, be it environmentalism or social issues or whatever, they put it, top three, one of their agendas. But they're probably not spending that way just yet. But my personal view is they may not be yet, but they will be. If we look at the way the syllabus that's in schools and what's going through secondary schools and primary schools, those are our consumers of the next 5-10 years. Their attitudes are fundamentally different, certainly from my generation or our generations, and so they will make those choices. It's just probably not backed up by the hard science of they making the choices yet, which I think sometimes in the board table can create a challenging tension because you could invest lots of money here, but actually is the return obvious or immediate? Yes, it's the right thing to do, but are you going to see an in-year, certainly, well, arguably not an in-year, but are you going to see a relatively short-term return?
Which leads nicely into my next question around long-term aspirations about social mobility, whether that's organisational or from a personal perspective. What are your aspirations around achievements in the social mobility space? What would you like to have achieved in the next 5 or 10 years in this area?
We're organisations that attract the very best people. And that by definition means that to get the right source of ideas, the right source of innovation, we've got to have a diverse workforce. And that diverse workforce is much broader than the gender debate. It's much broader than the race debate. It's really multifaceted. And I look forward to sort of be able to walk into any team meeting, any management meeting with the sort of the reassurance and the knowledge that I've got the very best people around the table that have come from from all walks of life, representing society, and then that actually starts to manifest in terms of how we then engage with our customers, because there's actually a better understanding, there's a better preparedness of so we've got customers stranding the whole of the socio-economic, and we've got to do that. So whether we we start saying, well, actually we're going to start to put some real hard targets in place, and we say, well, 10% from this background, I don't know. You may have to do that to really give the organisation a good kick, but I think having that that sense that we've just got to have a very fluid mix of people coming through the organisation is really important. So we've put, for example, we work quite hard in terms of women in tech. So a lot of people in our organisation work in certain tech. We haven't historically had enough females coming through into the tech, and we worked it, and you start having people come through, and you just find different contributions, different things happening. And I just hope that we just look forwards, and we've got the very best people around the table from the widest group of people we possibly can. And and all the sorts of prejudices and also we just park them at the door, and people come in and they're able to be themselves, be authentic, and we do some great things.
Bob?
I think it's an interesting question because I'm not sure I have an end point in mind. I think one of the things that does need to change is it is challenging for organisations to work with third parties, with NGOs, particularly in the charitable sector. And a lot of that is down to slightly, maybe not quite fully aligned goals or aspirations, and sometimes it's to do with resource capability and things like that. I think to unlock this as an issue, and I suppose social mobility is the language we're using today, but really for me it's probably economic inclusion is really what we're talking about. Ultimately, those who are not currently included in the economy become included, and you see that the power of an income and what that can do both for the individual and their immediate family or people around them. I think to do that, different areas need to play. So government needs to play in the right way, and the third sector needs to play in its space, because actually they have core competencies, and I think the charitable sector is very, very good at grassroots local connection. And I think in many instances, companies are not, right? And nor should they become. That's not what they need to become. They're not a social outreach engine themselves. However, the job is transitioning from ultimately excluded communities through the third sector into companies and how they fit together. So I think that would be, and it's also this sort of, we've had decades of employability programs being sponsored through the government, and I think we're still talking about the same issues that we've been talking about for a very long time. So I guess sort of, if I was to wave a wand, would we move into a space where the narrative changes a little bit about these employability programs, and actually we found something that works? And I'm sort of with you. I'm not sure about the targets. I'm probably a little bit on the edge on this, because on one side, targets drive outcomes, and I've seen that, and you see it through the diversity, conversational representation. Softly doesn't always necessarily drive an outcome. However, I wonder if it might be defeating the point of inclusion if it gets pushed too far. And so I'm probably a little bit on the fence about whether or not targets would ultimately be the right thing. You know, there's an interesting one if you go all the way back. The gender pay report initially was a thing that was effectively a government target, right? That's what it was, or not, you know, government measurement. And actually, it's had hugely positive impact, I think, across businesses, because companies that didn't focus as hard as they could have done actually have been forced to through legislation. And I think that's a positive example of government intervention. And there could be another like that.
And what best practice or advice would you give to other organisations embarking upon a conversation around social mobility, economic inclusion? Because while both of you have been talking about this subject for a long time, there are plenty of organisations for whom there's no discussion in their organisation about economic inclusion, social mobility initiatives, or even factoring as part of the inclusion or diversity agenda. And I speak to plenty of those on a regular basis. So what would you say for those organisations who are just starting to think about what do we do here?
So I think even some of the language is a bit daunting as an employer. You know, you think, oh God, right, so do I know what this means, or what does it mean in my context? I suppose the gentle advice would be get started, actually, because my own experience over, you know, almost 12, 15 years of working in this space is by getting starting, you learn, and there isn't anyone doing it perfectly. I think that's probably my main reflection, is there isn't an organisation that says, right, this is the boilerplate, this is the blueprint for perfection, because every company's different, every type of job they create is different, and sort of therefore the way they fit in, or the niche they fit into, is different. So I think you can start small and learn. And the other thing I'd say, just repeating something I said earlier on, is don't get behind on the data, actually. And it can be as rudimentary as, you know, tracking on a spreadsheet. It doesn't need to be more highfalutin than that. But understanding what you've done and the actual impact of your activity. Otherwise, it runs the risk of being a bit of a sort of HR vanity project. And that ultimately withers. It doesn't last in a business. And so data, verifiable data, and tracking the impact of what you're doing and what is working, but also being okay to say, look, that's not working. This partnership with this charity doesn't work, or this is, we've gone down a blind alley, we shouldn't have done this cause, you know, that's not right, let's go back. But actually, your employees will not critique you for trying. So that would be my advice.
I'd echo that. I think get started. Start with some small pilots. I think that's important. But actually, as part of that getting started, I would actually use that as a conversation to engage with your employees, to actually say, well, actually, what areas are you interested in? Is there anybody that's got a particular passion? Is there a particular group? and just, go for something that's actually going to sort of work. It's going to help people with their jobs. Perhaps, you've got areas which have been typically sort of very difficult to recruit in, and maybe those are opportunities. And then it's actually just turning it to an advantage. Like, oh, wow, we did this and it's actually sort of making a difference. It's helping. Okay, let's go do a little bit more. So if I go back to the Kickstart thing, we actually sort of put people into areas that had been a little bit difficult to recruit in and stuff. And our manager said, wow, these are really good people. Oh my word, can we have some more? And it just drives a hunger. So I suppose check out where that sort of latent demand may be in your organisation and probably start there. If people see it's actually helping them, then I think they'll jump in and it'll be sort of a more positive experience.
Don't be afraid to be opportunistic as well.
100%.
Yeah. I'm going to go out of order because I want to ask a question that I didn't ask earlier. So sorry, it feels a bit odd. On the data point, we've talked about the difficulty of recording data. And from my conversations, every organisation has a different measure around social mobility or economic inclusion. And Rob, you talked about household income for previous generations. There's a lot in there in many organisations around degree status. What have you seen really work, and where's your thoughts on how you measure it? What's the question that you should be asking?
So the three measures we've used are first-time employment, free school meals at either 14 or 16, whichever one of those two, income of primary bread earner in family, and also not in tertiary education, so not in training or education. And I think we got those, shamelessly taken from the YouGov polling. It's not made up by us, so that's where those parameters came from.
Very, 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 very similar. We're interested, particularly sort of for what we have been doing in the sort of economic backgrounds that people have come from, and looking at sort of household income, long-term unemployment, from going back sort of a couple of generations and stuff, and that's usually sort of a reasonable indicator for that side of stuff in terms of how it works. And then for other areas of social inclusion, we're just looking maybe at sort of at education. It's just different experience, and it's just because again, there's such a wide gamut. It's just depending on where you're going to sort of focus yourself. It's just but probably sort of most of it's around sort of first time at work. Then one of the areas we're starting to sort of think about a lot more now is employment of over 55s, and that comes with all sorts of different sort of connotations in terms of reskilling. Where have you been historically? Technology skills, etc. And I think that's going to present itself as a massive opportunity for businesses as we go forward.
And it's one of the areas, one of the protected characteristics that inevitably happens to all of us, and that most organisations aren't really talking about very much. No, we're all going to get old.
Yeah, we're all going to get old, and we're all going to need to work a little bit longer. So we've all got a vested interest in trying to focus on that one. And there's various different government initiatives to work through. I think that's going to become, I don't know, it's sort of quite easy and quite visible to think about sort of kids that have left school at 16, and it's harder thinking about over 55s, and there's all sorts of social stigmas attached there and stuff. I think that's going to become a sort of a big battleground.
Completely agree. Yeah.
I wonder if either of you have any specific examples, obviously without sharing personal details, of success stories where you have seen economic inclusion or social mobility activity really have an impact on a particular person or group of people to talk about.
I've got one that jumps to mind actually. It probably sticks most firmly because one of the first people in one of the first programs I was ever involved in. So probably back in 2010, 2011. At that point, I was working in the telecoms part of Tesco, and I set up a scheme around how you can get people from the shop floor and give them office type experiences. Originally, it was very, very small at scale. It was, come and do 3 months of a work placement and get an idea of what it's like to work in an office. This one individual came in, I think he was 17 at the time, so he, I can't have been 17. Well, no, he was still studying actually. Yes, sorry. So young, and he came in and he worked on the desk, like sort of the call desk initially. And I looked him up recently, just out of curiosity, whatever it is, 10, 11 years later, and he's now doing a very senior job in the telecoms industry, having continued to ply his trade with Tesco for a very long time and risen up through the ranks. And it's kind of remarkable. I'm sure he probably wouldn't even remember who I am, frankly. But that's not really the point. But it's remarkable to see, almost 10 years does go by in a blink of an eye, scarily, but how far and how wide an impact by just giving someone an opportunity and watching them completely change their prospects. I would be very surprised if he would be doing what he's doing were it not for some of those early experiences and how he was nurtured through his career, through that telecoms world. So yeah, that sort of was a random point of pride actually recently.
And I don't think you can underestimate the impact on the individuals that are helping to create those opportunities as well. As you were talking, I was sort of smiling because not only have you in some way impacted that individual's career, I would imagine that the conversation we're having today has been heavily impacted by your experience with that person earlier in your career. And I can certainly remember giving some interview guidance to a care leaver at the age of 18, and that was probably 20 years ago. And I can still remember a lot about him and his experiences that helped me see how, by doing my job in a different way, I might be able to make a difference in this space too. So it goes both ways, doesn't it?
It definitely does. And at its, we have all these words around it, but at a very simple level, it's just giving people a chance.
Which is where we started.
That's literally back to the beginning. It's all it is. And it doesn't need to be complicated.
What about your experiences individually?
I think there's two that I'll point towards. I think one of the areas which is really sort of quite challenging is the sort of the area of care leavers. So we have about 10,000 young people a year who leave council care, and they sort of have to fend for themselves sort of at age 18. They're some of the most vulnerable people around, and have a couple of examples of people who've been able to help into the workplace, and actually just seeing them sort of grow and actually come up the ladder. And this is an area of a huge proportion of people there are ones that that can't cope by themselves, and crime kicks in, and just it's awful what happens. But actually, because they were in a structured work environment, actually saw one of them in particular make their way through, and actually is now flourishing as a manager. And it's just like, wow, that's just so cool. And that was brill. And then one of my colleagues phoned me up a few weeks ago, really excited. I said, well, what's going on? He said, I was staying in a hotel, and I was chatting to the guy with disability. He was in a wheelchair, and he explained that he had a job working for a particular charity, and he was really excited about it. And I said to him that I work for TalkTalk, and the guy's face lit up. He said, you guys, you changed my life inside out. I didn't have the internet, and you got me the internet, and I got this brilliant job, and I able to work remotely. And oh my God, fantastic! We can stop now, because actually that's something that's happened. And and I hope the guy goes from strength to strength. And again, it's just the little things that can just transform people's lives, and that's just humbling.
Thank you. I know you were keen to talk about the relationship between organisations and social enterprise. Daniel, perhaps you talk a little bit about that for us and help bring that to the fore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a certain amount that you're able to do as an organisation, bringing people in and starting to to work that. But then there's a whole cast of other opportunities that you can work with. There is your supply chain. There are people who actually they're not necessarily interested in coming and working in a big organisation. They've got their own views and want to run a business. And I've also while I've been looking at social mobility, I've been absolutely humbled by some of the things that I've seen in terms of social enterprises. So people maybe coming out of prison, maybe coming out of care, all sorts of different. But a couple of them I've seen, they've just through again support and mentoring, they've established businesses, and these businesses have just flourished and taken off. And again, as organisations, we're able to put some seed money in to help people. It could be something that that is indirectly related to to some of the things that we do. But I think we shouldn't, as we seek to look at the social mobility agenda, it doesn't necessarily have to be just about employment. It can be looking at some local businesses that social enterprises that just need a little bit of injection of cash. and wow, you can actually sort of see some stuff take off and sort of and flourish. And there's 2 or 3 that I've seen which you just sit back and think, whoa, this is really quite cool. And there's one particular sort of business that I came across with somebody who used to be sort of in prison, and he's sort of come out and he sort of got some funding for a social enterprise, and he's now running a sort of a hugely successful training business. And you think, okay, fine, there are other ways as well. And it's just don't limit yourself. I think be expansive in your thoughts of how you sort of you get involved in this. And the other bit, to be honest with you, I do sort of unashamedly is as I work through and I sort of look at people who are going to be suppliers and are going to partner with us, I'll ask them all this question: well, what are you doing? How are you sort of promoting the social agenda? What's going on? Ultimately it's going to be sort of commercial decisions, but I want to I'm interested in hearing sort of what they're up to and what's going on. It's important.
And that's definitely coming to the fore more and more. I mean, in supplier conversations, for us as an organisation, the expectation is that we can talk about this stuff because of what we do, but also we're making changes in our own supply chain and the way that we bring on third-party suppliers for exactly the same reason. And so we've seen it on the other side of the table too.
Yeah, no, it's and it's I mean, there's a project that I've been involved in sort of recently with Gordon Brown, the ex-Prime Minister, and Amazon, and it was a social enterprise, and he was concerned that Amazon were putting quite a lot of their returns into landfill. I thought, crikey, we must be able to have a circular economy here. What's going on? And Amazon sort of came forward and they said, well, if you can find an effective way of redistributing stuff, then we can sort of, we're very happy to sort of, to gift you some of these returns and see what you can do. And that's turned into setting up some wholesale or some distribution centres that local food banks can now come to and sort of get their stuff, and people then come to the sort of the food banks and and it circulates. And that's another example of social enterprise and really big business jumping in saying, actually, whoa, let's think about this stuff differently. And I'm really encouraged because there are a number of these things that are sort of are jumping up, and and just I love hearing about it. And the Amazon example is not the end of it. There will be sort of loads more like that happen, and it's just great. I mean, it's corporations saying, actually, no, we have got a role to play in society at large, and we're going to. And sometimes it's not about sort of shoving in a sort of a load of money. It's just saying, whoa, we've got let's think about the environmental agenda. It would actually be better to give people this stuff than shove it in the ground. So yeah, I find some stuff that I find actually quite inspiring going on.
And are there particular places or resources that you might point people to find out more about this subject?
I mean, you mentioned something earlier on, but I think it's good. I mean, the Prince's Trust do some very good work in this space, and they have the Social Mobility Index, I think it's called, which they publish annually. But there are a number of other organisations which do. There's a Social Mobility Foundation, which also do some important work in this space. So there's quite a lot available. I think, and everyone will have their own, I'm sure, Daniel, you'll have your own thoughts around this, but I've approached this very much from being curious around almost the sort of political landscape as well. Like, what has changed? Where is there care and support in different communities? And therefore, what are the issues at a sort of more local level? I think as a CPO of a business, the need to understand what's going on in society is massive. And so, yeah, it's as much a curiosity about the country we operate in, as well as the sort of the more perhaps academic side of it, which is done through some of the third parties or even some government bodies as well.
I have to say this. Surprised I'm saying it, but I am saying it. That I've actually found the Department of Work and Pensions actually sort of remarkably helpful. And I guess for anybody starting the journey, you're not far from a job centre, and job centres will have a sort of have a certain amount of people that we're talking about sort of coming through the door, so that's quite easy to access. And then there are just numerous charities, be that the Prince's Trust, that just sit all over the place, that frankly will probably already be sort of knocking on your door. It's just a case of taking the call and having the conversation and finding someone who looks sensible, who you can work with, and fine. Or Google either of us and we can sort of probably give you a sort of a nudge in the right direction. Yeah.
Thank you. Daniel, Rob, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you today, and thank you for sharing your experiences both on the professional side and a bit more personal as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening. To hear more of our insights and interviews with senior leaders, you can subscribe to the Eton Bridge podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or you can watch the full interview on YouTube. Keep in touch with us via our LinkedIn page to hear about our regular news and insights.